So our expenses application is working very well already. But during this lecture, I want to improve it. There is a slight thing that it's not doing yet, and change the UI a little bit so it resembles something that you may find more commonly on everyday applications. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the fact, and let me go ahead and run this application to show you that if I add a new expense, it's not immediately accessible in these couple of list views. So if I were to add, let's say that I'm going to add a fourth expense in here. Let's say that I bought an expensive mouse in here or something. And so this is a different category from the ones that I have. Let me just select other. And if I click on save, notice that by default or immediately we don't see this new element listed, nor in the other category do we see the updated percentage. So that is what I want to change in here. Really, the only thing that I have to do is, with the categories and the expenses pages, call the method that is inside of the categories and expenses view models. There is a get expenses method in one, and there is maybe just get the expenses category method call from here as well. Now, to be able to do that every single time we navigate back to the page, what I will do, and let me go ahead and start in the categories page, is override the onAppearing method. The onAppearing method is precisely the one that gets executed every single time this page is going to be appearing. Not only the first time, but every time we navigate back here. Unlike the constructor, of course, which is only fired the first time. So what I want to do in here is call a method from the categories VM. Now, how do we do that? We know that we already have this resource available, and that it's precisely the categories VM. So the best thing that we could do in here is get this resource programmatically, maybe here inside of the onAppearing, and because that resource is going to be a categories VM object, just call the get expenses per category. And because it's actually going to be the same object that we're already using to bind to the item source, this is going to be updated in the same category expenses collection. And because this is an observable collection, it means that the view will observe or get notified for any changes in that collection, so it should be updated. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's first and foremost get that resource that we are defining here on SAML from C#. So the first thing that I will do is actually define a variable that is going to be a categories VM variable. I need a using directive for that. This is going to be my view model. And now that I have the view model, let me actually from the constructor set the view model to that resource that I already have on SAML. So to access that resource, we can actually just go ahead and access the resources, which is a property of a content page, which is precisely the same thing that we are defining over here to our resource dictionary. And because it's a dictionary, we can simply set the index for the resource that we want to access, which in our case is VM. Just like this, we are actually getting the resource. Now, by default, each resource is of type object, and we don't want the object just as an object. We want it to be a categories VM. So we can simply write as categories VM to get the resource as the correct type. Which means that now all we have to do is, in the onAppearing, from the view model, call, in this case for the categories VM, the get expenses per category method. Which means that I have to make this public first. So let's make that public, and now we can call the get expenses per category. Something very similar then has to happen with the expenses page. The expenses page, let me go ahead and override first the onAppearing. Let me go ahead and define a new expenses VM view model variable, which is going to be from the constructor set to the resources. In this is also called VM, and I will get this as an expenses VM value. And from the onAppearing, from the view model, I will have to call the getExpenses method, so that means that I will have to make this public. So over here, I just call the getExpenses method. Now this means that both of these methods that I'm now calling from the onAppearing method are going to be called every time we navigate back to these pages. So our list views should be updated with whatever update we see. Now I did find immediately a bug in here because I'm not clearing the observable collection correctly, but let me go ahead and navigate over to the new expense page, create yet another expense, and let me actually, for some reason, coffee is going to be housing. Let's actually call this rent. Click on save. And now you can see that the list view is actually updated immediately as we navigate back. Now in my categories, I do have a bug. Let me go ahead and solve it very quickly. In my categories VM, actually over here, I am not clearing the observable collection of category expenses. So here, category expenses collection is going to be cleared. Now that is easy to solve that small bug. But the main thing that I want to take a look at in this lecture is in the new expenses page, I want to change the view. Instead of using some elements, I want to use something that is a little bit more common and probably a little bit more efficient and just looks more native. So what I will do is replace what is inside of this stack layout with a table view. Now I won't be deleting this yet, give me a second, but I will define a table view in here. Now bear with me, I'm going to show you what the table view looks like in just a minute. But first, inside of the table view, let me define the table root. And inside of the table root, I am going to be defining a table section. Of course, you can have many different table sections in here. I really only need one single section for this example. Table sections, by the way, can have a title, so you could set this to new expense. Now I'm just setting a title in here to show you how it looks. I wouldn't normally set a title when there is only one section, but just to show you. And then inside of the table section, I can define many cells and many different types of cells. I could, for example, define an entry cell, which is precisely the one that is going to be replacing the first entry that we have over here. Now, for these kind of cells, what I want to do is set a label, which is actually going to be a small label, not the actual text that the user is going to be writing, but this will be very clear what I'm doing with the table view in just a minute when I test this. But let's just write here name, and I can still set a placeholder just as I did with the normal entry, and set the text to the same binding that I did with the normal entry. So basically, I'm going to be replacing these elements with entries or cells inside of this table view. Now, there are entry cells, but there are not datetime or date picker cells, but there are view cells, which, similar to what we saw with the list view, are going to allow us to define anything inside of them. So if there is not a specific cell for what you want to input in here, you can always just create your own. So let me go ahead and create a view cell for the date picker. So all I'm doing here is inside of the view cell setting a stack layout with the label that is going to replace the label properties inside of these entry cells, and the date picker itself, which is still identical. I am in here setting a couple of things for this to be better aligned with the cell, as you will see in just a second, but basically the date is exactly the same thing. Now let's do something similar with the picker. So again, we're going to need a stack layout, the label, the picker as well is going to be identical, except now I have some vertical options and horizontal options to align this better. So let me go ahead and show you what the result is of replacing these elements to cells inside of a table view. This is still going to work in the same way, by the way, But now notice that if I navigate over here, this looks a little bit more like you would see normally on an application. Now in here I'm setting some extra margin that maybe is not necessary, and again the title for the section that I just don't need in this case because there's only one section. But notice that now we see in the left the label that we were setting, and on the right the entry. And of course it's still going to work in the same way that it used to work. The binding is going to happen in the same way that it was happening. So for example, for the name, let's go ahead and say that I'm going to be paying for my credit card. I can keep setting the same date. Notice that the category is still there. Let's hit on done and hit on save. And we still see here the same element being saved. Everything is working in the exact same way. We see the debt being updated in this category section. By the way, you see the bug solved. Now we only see these once. So there you have it. The table view works in the exact same way, but looks, I think, a little bit better. Let me actually go ahead and get rid of the margin that may not be necessary, and from the title that I don't like for the section. And I think our application looks a bit more native now. Of course, on Android this would work very similar. Now, unfortunately, the table view, if you wanted to take a look at this, doesn't have an items source. So this doesn't really work like a list view would do. Now, most of the time, this is not necessary because you are writing this as if this were more of a stack layout than, by the way, I don't really need a stack layout in here, but this works more like a stack layout than a list view. But in the next lecture, I am going to show you how you could bind from C# a collection or a list to a table view for this to be populated from that item source. Let's call it item source, even though it's not really going to be that. So in the next lecture, we're going to take a look at this, and it's going to help us understand a bit more about how binding works, and if we ever needed that, how we can set some binding through C#.